So the United Kingdom today is, on average, per person, 40% poorer than the average person in the United States. It's still the case that businesses derive roughly 80% of their external financing from banks. In the United States, it's only 20%. The vast majority of external financing for businesses in the United States comes from venture capital, private equity, angel investors. In the United States, you have to be earning 8.5 times the average wage before you pay the top marginal tax rate. In the UK, if you're earning 3.5 times the average wage, you are paying the top marginal rate. So, what are some of the solutions?
Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this temporary and rather grand outpost of the Institute of Economic Affairs. My name's Tom Clougherty. I'm the Executive Director of the IEA. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker this evening, Tyler Goodspeed. Tyler and I met, I think, for the first time in 2009 at the Adam Smith Institute when he was studying for his master's at Cambridge. Just one part of an extraordinary academic resume with PhDs from both Harvard and Cambridge. Tyler has had fellowships at Oxford and at Stanford. He's taught at King's College London, and from 2017 to 2021, he was a member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, eventually becoming the acting chairman of that body. At the moment, he's a chief economist in the private sector, and tonight he's here to talk to us about what is perhaps the biggest question of our age, both in Britain and indeed for many other countries around the world: how to unlock UK growth, lessons from the past, and pathways for the future. Tyler Goodspeed.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Brian. I must say it is a real pleasure and privilege to be here this evening. It's a pleasure because, as Tom noted, when I arrived in the United Kingdom 15 years ago as a student, the approximately 100-meter radius around this building was very formative in my intellectual development, attending events just such as this, hosted by the IEA, the Adam Smith Institute, Taxpayers Alliance, and one individual who was particularly welcoming was none other than a younger, darker-haired Tom Clougherty, who subsequently, in the intervening years, got a job in the United States, married an American, returned to the United Kingdom, and in the meantime, I got a job in the United Kingdom, married a Brit, returned to the United States. So I feel, in a sense, we've both come full circle. It's also a privilege because as we contemplate the magnitude of the growth challenge facing the United Kingdom today, we can draw some assurance and inspiration from the knowledge that this is a path the United Kingdom has trodden before, led, among others, by the late Lord Harris. I think it's important to start with a blunt statement of fact. So the United Kingdom today is approximately, on average, per person, 40% poorer than the average person in the United States. A U.S. worker could stop producing in August and still produce more in the year than the average UK worker working through the end of December. The poorest state in the United States today is Mississippi. If the United Kingdom were a member of the United States, they would be poorer than Mississippi. And the poorest states in the United States today have the benefit of actually growing at a pretty decent clip, 2%, 3%, 4% per year, compared to 1% of the UK. To explain this gap, I had, and I choose the tense deliberately, I had a thesis in mind. And I should disclaim up front that the views I express this evening are my own and should not be in any way interpreted as representing the views of any past, present, or future employer. The hypothesis I had went something like this. There are basically two different types of growth. You can either grow an economy by employing more inputs or employing them more efficiently, given the existing state of technical knowledge, or if you've already exhausted the employment, you've fully and efficiently employed your inputs, then you can learn how to utilize those inputs more productively. So my thesis was the United Kingdom and most of Western Europe is now so far from the frontier of technologically feasible production possibilities that the real change over the past decade or two has been a degradation in the ability of the economy to simply employ existing inputs efficiently. Take land. It's an important factor of production. There's no such thing as a free lunch, but there are some pretty cheap lunches. And a pretty cheap lunch is simply allowing people and businesses to move from where productivity growth is relatively low and unemployment relatively high to where productivity growth is relatively high and unemployment relatively low. Now, fortunately, in the United Kingdom, that movement is constrained because Clement Attlee had the brilliant idea to basically draw rings around all of the UK's most productive urban conurbations and declare you can't build here with the green belts. For much of UK history, UK was a prolific producer and net exporter of primary energy products. Could be today, but unfortunately the state either makes it prohibitively expensive or outright prohibits the production of primary energy products. I can tell you, it's a lot cheaper to source your marginal supply of gas, natural gas, from domestically produced shale gas and plug it into an integrated pipeline network than it is to freeze gas in the United States, ship it across the Atlantic, unfreeze it, and then pipe it in. So, to sum it up, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone is not the most efficient use of land. What about capital markets? Well, in the United Kingdom today, it's still the case. It's better than it was 30, 40 years ago, but in the United Kingdom today, it's still the case that businesses derive roughly 80% of their external financing from banks. In the United States, it's only 20%. The vast majority of external financing for businesses in the United States comes from venture capital, private equity, angel investors, other non-bank sources of capital, and we also still have thousands of regional banks that engage in relationship lending. Now, why is that important? Well, if you think about a small or medium-sized enterprise that's trying to grow, if you think about a young firm that maybe doesn't have much credit history, if you think of a firm that doesn't have many physical assets that they can pledge as collateral for a conventional bank loan, for example, tech companies with intangible assets, their main assets are their ideas. A lot of those types of firms are not going to be able to access external financing to grow beyond what their cash flow will allow. And then finally, labor. The UK faces stronger demographic headwinds than the United States. Their average age is older, they're aging more rapidly, and yet the UK maintains a higher average tax rate on labor income. Moreover, whereas in the United States, you have to be earning 8.5 times the average wage before you pay the top marginal tax rate, in the UK, if you're earning 3.5 times the average wage, you are paying the top marginal rate And who responds the most to changes in marginal personal income tax rates? Older workers. So when you're looking at this and you're looking at the fact that historically the United Kingdom had lower rates of labor force participation, I would say labor is being underutilized. So there you have land, energy, capital, labor not being fully, efficiently employed. But there's a problem with the thesis. The one problem is Clement Attlee's Town and Country Planning Act has been law since 1947. Now, one could come up with a plausible reason why that could become more binding over time. Network economies are much more important today than they were 50 years ago. Agglomeration effects, think Silicon Valley. The reason some tech companies still today, despite all of California's pathologies, I lived there, despite all of California and the Bay Area's pathologies, tech companies today still locate in Silicon Valley because that's where the venture capital is. That's where a lot of the technical expertise still is. So those gravitational effects can be very persistent. I noted the problems in bank financing in the United Kingdom. That's a long history. You can go back to 1931. There was a parliamentary committee report on whether or not British finance was doing an adequate enough job channeling investment into British industry. And they identified what subsequently became known as the Macmillan Gap, that British finance historically did not do a good job channeling financing to small and medium-sized enterprises. That's not what the City of London did, as Brian mentioned. Moreover, the Town and Country Planning Act restricted growth in urban areas. Well, if you look at where productivity growth in the United States has been strongest over the past decade or two, it's precisely in places like Silicon Valley that actually have some of the most strict zoning restrictions of anywhere in the United States. And then labor force participation in the United Kingdom, yes, historically lower than in the United States, but not since 2013. Continuously since 2013, labor force participation in the United Kingdom has actually been higher than in the United States. And while the United Kingdom is no longer a net exporter of primary energy products, North Sea oil production peaked in 1999. Coal production peaked in 1913. So why are we feeling this so much more now? And the other problem with the thesis, and I'm not disowning the thesis, don't get me wrong, I think all of what I said is true, and all of those are headwinds to growth. But this was the other challenge. So this is simply real GDP per capita in the United States and the United Kingdom since 1955, and I fitted an estimated trend. And you can see it's remarkable how faithful to trend actual real GDP per capita has been in the two countries. It's a little secret in macroeconomics that recessions come, recessions go. If you zoom out long enough, they tend to look pretty much like blips. And actually, over this entire period through 2007, so this sample ends in 2007, over that entire period, real GDP per capita in the United Kingdom grew at 2.3%, 2.2% in the United States. It's bound to be some measurement error, so let's just call it even. Then we get to 2008, the global financial crisis. And this happens. So there's a level effect in real GDP per capita that happens in both economies, and that persists. That is a deficit relative to trend that persists in both countries. But it's worse in the United Kingdom because there's also a slope change. There's a change in the rate of growth. The United States suffered a drop and then essentially returned to trend growth. The United Kingdom has a slope change. And this is unusual. Actually, both sides of this graph are unusual. This side is even more unusual because Milton Friedman had a model of economic fluctuations. Economic fluctuations are really not about boom and bust. It's about an economy that's growing just about pretty much close to its trend, long-term trends, and then you get an adverse shock. The economy temporarily deviates from that trend, and then it bounces back and recovers back to that trend. That didn't happen here. And actually, we can see it's even more pronounced if we just assume, okay, suppose the recession didn't happen. Let's suppose that instead of outright contracting in 2008, 2009, the US and UK economies continued to grow at trend through the recession period, and then afterward just grew as they actually did. So if there was no recessionary contraction, the US would have been basically back on trend. But that level effect during the recession can only explain about a third of the deficit of UK real GDP per capita relative to trend. The rest is all a change in the subsequent rate of growth. Why might the global financial crisis have had such a bigger, more persistent impact in the United Kingdom? I would draw your attention to this graph. This is a graph of the supply of real credit from banks to the private non-financial sector. So this is basically bank lending adjusted for inflation to the business community. And you can see it declined in both economies initially in 2008, 2009. Actually, but in the United Kingdom, it recovered by 2010. In the US, it troughed in about 2012. By 2016, it had fully recovered to its pre-GFC level, and then has been slow growing since. But in the United Kingdom, plunged sharply after 2010 and has never recovered. Why might the GFC have had this sort of effect in the United Kingdom but not in the United States? I think there's reason to think that the UK economy was likely to be more vulnerable to a banking crisis, and more importantly, to the regulatory response to that crisis. So, first of all, noted already that banks account for a bigger share of business lending in the United Kingdom. So they're already going to be, UK is already going to be more impacted by a crisis in banking. Also note that in the United Kingdom, there are fewer and on average larger banks. Only about 280 banks in the United Kingdom compared to about 5,000 in the United States. And what that means is there are going to be more of British banking was affected by the post-GFC increase in tiered capital requirements. So if you're above a certain threshold as a bank, you're going to have to hold more regulatory capital. You're going to be subject to enhanced stress testing, the outcome of which is you need to either reduce the size of your balance sheet or else hold more government bonds that have a risk weight of 0. You also, in 2010, after 2010, you have a bank levy in the United Kingdom. Usually, if you tax something, you get less of it. So if you tax the size of a bank balance sheet, you're probably going to get smaller bank balance sheets, with the exception that untaxed were liabilities that were backed by UK government bonds. You also had the rollout of a liquidity coverage ratio. So basically, the government mandated that UK banks had to hold enough high-quality liquid assets, by which they meant UK government bonds, to cover 30 days of liquidity needs in excess of cash flow. So you layer all this onto an economy that is more reliant on banking, has more banks covered by the new regulatory regime, and don't be surprised if you get a contraction in overall bank lending to the private sector and actually an increase in bank lending to the public sector. And indeed, my back-of-the-envelope calculations suggest that as much as 30 to 50% of this decline can be accounted for by a substitution of public for private lending by UK banks. And by the way, this is not unique to the United Kingdom. You look at a lot of European economies, and they look pretty similar because the structure of their banking is similar. They have few banks, they're large, they're covered by the post-GFC regime. And I think this actually draws our attention to basically two different types of shocks in economics, two different sources of fluctuations in economic growth. Not sources of growth, but sources of fluctuations in growth. You can either have large aggregate shocks that affect all sectors, even if sectors aren't particularly linked. Firms can easily find substitutes. So think war, monetary policy shock. Or you can have shocks that are relatively narrowly focused, affecting only one or two sectors, but there are very strong linkages between sectors, and it's not easy for firms to find substitutes for inputs. And there's a growing body of literature that it's the latter type of shock that matters much more for economic fluctuations. So we just saw two. When it comes to sectors with lots of linkages to the rest of the economy, I would say it's hard to have capitalism without capital. So a shock, regulatory or otherwise, to the banking sector is not going to be confined to banking. And energy. Energy price shocks have been a serial killer of economic expansions in the United States and United Kingdom over the past 80 years. And in fact, energy shocks contributed to 4 of the 5 post-war UK recessions: 1973, 1979, 1990, and even actually 2008. Because it permeates everything. And in the short run, there's no substitute. You can't heat a home that relies on LNG gas, on piped gas, with an oil furnace. There's no substitute in the short term. You can't run a container ship that was built to run on diesel to instead just temporarily burn coal. So these sector-specific shocks can have, with microeconomic foundations, can have macroeconomic implications. Now, we're here to honor a man who didn't just point out problems, he actually proposed solutions. And what's interesting is despite the fidelity to trend that you see here, there are actually a few other structural breaks. If you do a statistical test for when were there structural breaks in the trend, structural breaks in growth, there was one in 1973 towards slower growth, and there was another right at the tail end of Lord Harris's time as IEA Director General toward faster growth. So, what are some of the solutions? And I'm not going to bother with, though I think that you should do them, full expensing of new equipment investment, lower marginal tax rates, those policy things, because I think the lessons are more fundamental as they were from the 1960s and 1970s. One is, I think policymakers should adhere to some form of the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. And they would be advised to not unduly impair the productive potential of economic activities in which the economy has historically had a comparative advantage. The UK economy has historically had a very strong comparative advantage in transforming savings into productive investments. The UK economy has historically had a comparative advantage in extracting and transforming molecules to release energy. Yet those are two endeavors to which contemporary elite political opinion seems to be particularly hostile. Second, remember, people are policy. Look at the composition, look at the membership of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee or Financial Policy Committee, and ask yourself if any of those appointments would have looked any different over the past 15 years under a Labour government versus a Conservative government. And if your answer to that question is no, I think the answer to that question is no. And if you think that monetary and financial policy in the United Kingdom over the past 15 years has been suboptimal, then that is an easily remediable problem. Appoint better people. And it is incumbent upon organizations like the IEA to cultivate that talent, and in particular to cultivate that next generation talent. And finally, I'd just like to conclude on this point. I'd say another key lesson of 1979 for the United Kingdom specifically is that there is no substitute for senior political leadership, for leadership at the most senior level. There's no substitute for senior political leadership with intellectual conviction. In the United States, I've been in the policymaking world in the United States, there are enough competing sources of political power. The state, local, federal level, executive, legislative, judicial, even within the legislative, you have the House and the Senate, a majority, minority in each. There are enough competing sources of political power that bad ideas may occasionally get through, actually do often get through, but a lot of bad ideas can be blocked, and good ideas can get through. So my adopted state is now Texas, and it's no wonder that the U.S. shale revolution continued all throughout the Obama years. Why? Because a lot of that revolution was occurring on private land in Texas and North Dakota. Texas is now the third largest oil producer in the world. It's the Russian Federation, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the state of Texas. Here, political power seems to be, from my external observation, much more concentrated around the PM and everyone close to the PM. And so everyone's dancing on the head of a pin, trying to please the PM, trying to get on his or her right side so that they can climb the next rung in the ministerial ladder. And in the meantime, the incentives are not there for them to be doing much in terms of actually changing things. In fact, the risk is very much to the downside. So you better leave the mundane tasks of writing regulatory guidance, of making appointments to independent agencies. Leave that to the permanent secretaries while you focus on the politics of trying to get the next ministerial appointment. So if you want to return the United Kingdom to growth, then I would say that a necessary, not sufficient, but a necessary condition is that the PM believe fundamentally in the intellectual and indeed moral imperative for growth, because it is a moral imperative. And dare I say it, it requires a genuine commitment to make the United Kingdom great again. You've done it before. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. Is this on? Yes, it is. That was absolutely brilliant. What a tour de force. I feel like I've heard something really stimulating, groundbreaking this evening, and I feel privileged to have been here for it. If I could ask Christian to join us on the stage. So you come on up. I'm just going to be joined by first Christian Niemitz, who is editorial director at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and then by Christian Bjornskopf, who, as of today, is chairman of the IEA's Academic Advisory Council, is also a professor of economics at Aarhus University in Denmark. Thank you. Welcome. And I wonder if first I could ask each of you just for brief reflections on what Tyler said this evening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tyler. I couldn't agree more. I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. I think in basic terms, the growth problem of this country is a fairly simple one. The country doesn't grow because politicians don't allow it to. It's the main problem is simply that it's almost impossible to build anything here, whether that's residential housing, whether that's commercial property, offices, retail space, whatever, infrastructure, power stations. You get the same problem across the board. And we see that very much reflected in the figures. So if we look at the housing stock, for example, number of housing units per 1,000 inhabitants, in those terms, Britain is something like 13% below the European average. And that's not an ambitious benchmark, because the EU average, of course, that includes Eastern European countries that have a historic legacy and a lack of housing for that reason. So in absolute terms, just to catch up with the EU average, Britain would have to build something like 3.5 million houses, right? And why does that matter? Well, it's because that is a problem which is particularly pronounced in those parts of the country that are already relatively rich, relatively productive. And historically, one of the easiest ways for a country to grow has simply been to allow people to move from the relatively less productive, relatively less prosperous parts to the relatively more productive, relatively more prosperous parts. And if you do that here, so I've done some back-of-the-envelope calculations, what happens if, say, somebody in the middle of the income distribution in the northeast, northwest Wales moves to the southeast, and say you keep their position in the regional income distribution constant, what happens to their living standards? Well, their salary before taxes goes up a lot, but once you factor in housing costs, that eats up between a third up to all of the difference. So you can move from the poorest to the richest part and be almost no better off after housing costs. So of course people don't do it. We just constrain the outward growth of the most productive regions. And we see the same in other sectors. So energy, per capita electricity production here is only like 2/3 of the EU average. Again, EU average, that's not an ambitious benchmark. The EU, in those terms, is far behind the US. And again, completely for no reason, this should be an energy-rich country. And it's simply that we don't allow it to happen. We see it in physical infrastructure. So the road network, kilometers per capita, is also something like a third below the EU average, and this is true pretty much across the board. So airports, one of the things I wrote about, I think 12, 13 years ago was airport capacity. And I remember at the time, with the third runway at Heathrow, second runway at Gatwick, I remember at the time thinking, I hope they don't sort out this problem too quickly, because when my publication comes out, if they sort it out in the meantime, it will be obsolete. Well, here we are 13 years later, still absolutely nothing that's happened. It's the same pattern, whichever sector you look at. And so it's really no surprise that the country isn't growing. If anything, I'm a bit surprised that these problems didn't manifest themselves fully until the great financial crisis, because in a way, none of this would have been news to Ralph Harris. The IEA was writing about it at the time already. The only difference, I guess, was that at the time, Ralph Harris himself wouldn't have identified them as the main obstacles to growth. And they have just become more binding over time. They have over time become the main issue. I think that the big difference between Ralph Harris's days and ours is Ralph Harris spent most of his life battling against bad economic ideas, right? Keynesianism, activist industrial policy, Marxism. None of those ideas have gone away. We still write about them today. They're still very much with us. But they're not the reason for what we have seen here in the data, for this flattening of growth. And I guess now we have an opponent who is just harder to define. It's not a single ideology that we're up against. Nobody designed the system in that way. Nobody ever thought, oh, well, we'll just design a system in which nobody can build anything anywhere. Wouldn't that be a brilliant way to run an economy? It hasn't been built up in that way. But it is nonetheless there. It's nonetheless real. And that's what we are up against today.
And Christian Bjornskov.
Right. I also find myself in almost complete agreement with what Tyler said. It's a completely correct diagnosis of the problems. I had a look at the data earlier today. From the global financial crisis and on to now, last year, labor productivity increased by 18% in the UK and by only 4% here. So US 18%, UK 4%. So it's not just that we have a problem here of labor productivity, which is about 80% of American productivity, by the way. Half of the difference between American and British living standards are down to low productivity. The other half is that Brits just don't work a lot. What I find so frustrating is that if you look at, from a growth perspective, if you look at the UK, a lot of things are fine. You have excellent universities, even if you think that a lot of weird stuff is going on, and a lot of weird stuff is going on at universities, they're still really, really good compared to the rest of the world. You have excellent institutions. So go to India, for example, and ask if they think that British courts and the British judiciary is bad. It's not. You have a pretty well-educated and active population, but productivity has basically flatlined the last 5 years. It's almost as bad as Germany. So it's a case of the fact that policies interact. If you have one type of policy that's really bad, then you can do all sorts of good things in other policy areas. It's not going to make a difference. It's essentially what the Labour government is trying to do now is step on the accelerator all they can, while the other foot is firmly on the brake. Part of it might be capital markets. Part of it might be really bad ideas. However, I should say one thing here. It's not just bad ideas in bureaucracy, it's also bad ideas in politics. So one thing that always strikes me is that British politicians have not learned the lesson that Danish and Swedish politicians learned 25 years ago. If you want a large welfare state, you have to have an extremely capitalist private economy. So even on the Danish left, you would not see support for the kinds of policies that not only Labour is proposing right now, but what the Tories implemented the last 16 years. And the fact is, you can see that in the actual development. As I said, the US productivity grew by 18% the last 15, 16 years. Danish productivity, a huge welfare state, grew by 21%. So the fact that we're so poor is because we work even less than the Brits. We are actually, the private sector in Denmark is as productive as the American one. Our pity is just that it's only half of the economy. So my point here is that there is a lesson to be learned in British politics on both the left and the right, that there is a price to pay if you want large welfare benefits, a large welfare state, which seems to be the case for both major parties. You can't avoid having a very economically free private sector. And unfortunately, the UK doesn't have that anymore. Historically, it's had a very economically free society. Thatcher brought that back to some extent in the private sector. But if you look at Labour or if you look at the Tories, for the last 20 years, there have really been not much of a difference. And my point here is that it's because in British politics, people have forgotten that there is a price to pay, and it's a private sector that pays that price. So you better not step on the brake too much if you want to growth to resume.
Christian, thank you. Christian and Christian. Yeah. Tyler, I think what I'm most grateful for this evening with your remarks is that you've answered a question that's been nagging at me for a long time. There are all kinds of things we can point to as contributing to our growth problem. And in your early thesis, the first part of your talk, you mentioned a lot of them. And there are others as well, taxation and so on. What none of them explain is that step change with the global financial crisis in 2008-9. And I think what you've pointed to this evening is that, well as all of those other problems that we have, in some sense, we never stopped having a credit crunch. The credit crunch started with the global financial crisis, or precipitated the global financial crisis, and it's carried on for a decade and a half afterwards. Is this then fundamentally a question of financial regulation? Do you think there are differences between the regulatory response in the US and the UK you can point to? Is it simply that the US has a different kind of financial system? Businesses, as you say, are getting a lot more of their funding from private equity and so on, venture capital, rather than going to banks. Perhaps it's unfair to put you on the spot, and I won't ask you to name sort of chapter and verse of which regulations we need to deal with, but is that where your head is going as well?
Yes, and my preliminary response hypothesis would be that it's mostly about structure. As I said, 280 banks in the United Kingdom versus 5,000 in the United States. The initial threshold for enhanced stress testing and the enhanced tiered capital requirements in the United States was $50 billion in assets. 2018, we raised that to $100 billion in assets. So it's really only the biggest banks that are being covered. In the meantime, you have this whole other rich ecosystem of credit providers to households and businesses. Whereas in the United Kingdom, in France, I mean, it's a relatively small number of large financial institutions. I think the structure of the banking sector in most European economies is just going to be more impacted by the raft of financial regulatory changes that came after 2010. And it does interact with the productivity, because one thing that's fascinating, troubling, but fascinating about the productivity in the United Kingdom is the very long tail of firms. So you still have some great leading companies, but there's a very long tail of productivity laggards. And I think the financing is part of that. A majority of UK firms rely entirely on internal of retained earnings, on internal financing. And it's hard if you want to grow to more than a few employees. You want to grow above a certain size, you're probably going to need some external financing above and beyond, just financing things out of residual cash flow.
Yeah. So obviously, I'm delighted that you've shared this finding with us. I'm also worried because it's going to make our life a heck of a lot more difficult. I mean, land use planning. Well, I think we've started to win people around on the need for liberalisation there. Energy policy. Well, that seems to be running a little bit slower, but I think the tide is beginning to turn, and people are sort of seeing the benefits of cheap and abundant energy again. If our mission, though, is to turn back the tide of financial regulation that grew up in the wake of the financial crisis, or indeed if it's to try and foster a different structure of financial markets in the UK or capital markets in the UK, that's a very difficult proposition. Do you think that it's realistic for the UK to actually turn this thing around?
I do.
Oh, thank goodness.
It's where there is the political will, where there is political will for the state to take a step back. And I do think over the long run, yes, there are barriers to entry. There are substantial upfront fixed costs to being a new entrant into a sector, but I think over the long run, you will start to see private enterprise spot solutions. I mean, usually you don't have $50 and $100 bills left on the ground for too long. So if there are promising UK entrepreneurs, I think that there will be an appetite, there will be a supply of venture capital and private equity, but I'm surprised it's taken this long.
Well, of course, our best keep moving to America. Christian, and I think you made the interesting point at the end of your remarks that the enemy, if we want to use that terminology that we face now, is very different from the one that Lord Harris would have faced in his day. And that, in a sense, the enemy is everywhere. It's lurking in every bureaucracy, in every regulation. And in a sense, it's much harder to give it a face and a name than it once was. I think there is clear agreement, I think, up here on the stage that our problems are fundamentally regulatory to a certain extent. How do you think we go about addressing those challenges, given that it's not a simple Keynesian demand management doesn't work? It's much more of you have 1,000,001 different regulations and regulators that you have to try and unpick.
Yeah, I guess one upside of having an opponent who is harder to locate is that compared to Ralph Harris's days, that would mean that to be a liberalizer in terms of the obstacles that I've described means you can maybe build coalitions in ways that wouldn't have been possible in Ralph Harris's days. If you were a free marketeer in the 1980s, well, okay, you would have been seen as a Thatcherite, you would be on the right of politics, and somebody from the Labour left would see you as the enemy. Whereas nowadays, we get if you make a case for making it easier to build infrastructure, power stations, housing, you will sometimes find agreement from people on the center-left and people on the conservative right being most fiercely opposed. So you no longer have this pattern that you have a clear part of the ideological political spectrum where we fit in, where we can say, here are our friends, here are our opponents. It's much more, we can maybe reach out to people who in the 1980s would have been more hostile to us.
And if I can come to you, Christian, with one last thing, and I think perhaps we'll have some questions from the audience, but it's something we've talked about before, this central importance of economic growth, which, Tyler, as you say, is a moral imperative as much as a practical one. And we can find great economists in the US who are working on these topics. You've told me there are lots of people in Scandinavia working on these topics as well. We talked earlier today about some of the interesting work being done by Spanish economists, or at least Spanish-speaking economists. What's the state of growth economics in Britain, though? My impression from our previous discussions is that there's not a whole amount of energy in it. Is that a fair characterization?
I think that's a fair characterization. You get really excellent economic historians in Britain looking at historical British growth, but very few dealing with actual British growth right now. And the British economic profession has actually turned away from studying that for some years now. Of course, you have some people doing excellent work, but it's not a theme that's really, really a thing in Britain right now, compared to the US, for example, or compared to Spain.
Maybe we need some growth to get people excited about it and studying it again. All right, it's your turn in the audience. I think we have at least one microphone going around. The gentleman there had his hand up straight away. If we can please make sure the questions are indeed questions, and if you can tell us who you are before you ask it.
Yes, my name's Charlie White-Thompson. I'm from the ASI. Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was really, really enlightening. A question for Tyler, if I may. With the question of do no harm, do you think that decarbonising the grid by 2030 is doing harm, and should that be put back?
So it's not without cost. There's a few years ago, and actually even today, there are some who say that net zero can be achieved and it's good for the planet and it's good for growth. And I think the French economist Jean Pisani-Ferry has put it quite well, that there's a demand shock, which is that in the near term you need to make investments,
In more capital-intensive power production. But there's also a supply shock. You're talking about repricing a huge volume. In the United States, we emit 5 million megatons of CO2. We emitted 5 million megatons of CO2 last year. So if you're going to effectively reprice a huge volume of your primary energy production, it's rather akin to the 1973 oil embargo, where you were repricing a huge swath of primary energy production. And I don't think people think back on 1973-74 as a positive shock. So in the near term, that is a negative supply shock, which has costs. Now, on the other side of the balance sheet, you need to pay for a stable planet. But I think people need to recognize that this is not a zero cost transition. And it's not just, people think about motor vehicles. It's not just about it's power gen, it's maritime, it's aviation, which are very difficult to decarbonize in the near term. Thank you. I've got the lady over there by the window, and then Dan Freeman at the front.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Yemi Olushon. I run a business called The Change Hive. Question for you, Tyler, is what are your thoughts on this US new department called DOGE? Do we in the UK need a similar department? Or do you expect other countries to adopt that philosophy? And if so, how do we then balance it out with some sort of benevolence? Because a part of me is like, yes, DOGE, let's be more efficient with how we're spending the taxpayers' money. But at the same time, how do we make sure we don't become extreme capitalists and not take care of the weak and the vulnerable in society? And finally, how much of this is also cultural? Because, I spent some time in the US, and I have to say the attitude to entrepreneurship in the US is radically different to how it is in the UK. Do you have any thoughts on how we can change culture here and be more, yay, you got it, you're doing really well, fantastic? How can we be more American in our attitude to entrepreneurship? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Those are two great questions. So it's DOGE first, I guess, and then how can we be more American?
Yep. So I would recommend that folks take a look at the 2020 and 2021 economic reports of the president, in which there are chapters on regulation. And we tend to think about the cost of regulation as the compliance costs, the paper costs. But in those economic reports of the president, we spell out about how it can introduce distortionary incentives that can spill over from the regulated to unregulated sectors, and the costs are really much, much greater than the pure compliance costs. And I think we tabulated just 20 major regulatory changes during the 8 years of President Obama, and those combined, I think, were costing American households about $2,500 per year. So I would definitely recommend you look at those two chapters. And when it comes to DOGE, first of all, there is going to be a reconciliation bill in the United States to extend the 2017 tax cuts. And I think a lot of the pay-fors that were used in 2017 are probably not going to be politically feasible. So I think if you can get some cost savings from eliminating waste and inefficiency within government, then that would be great. Plow that into extending tax cuts. And I would also add with an anecdote that during the pandemic, the head of the U.S. Coronavirus Task Force, Dr. Deborah Birx, couldn't find anyone in the sprawling federal public health bureaucracy to basically just map the location of high-throughput testing machines so that we could see where the positives were coming from and where there was spare testing capacity, where there was excess demand. And so I said, well, my team, we're a bunch of social scientists. We know how to use ArcGIS. We'll do it. And I had a small team. All told, I think we were 30, including the interns. And so we were doing that, and then we started getting nightly data dumps from the major laboratories so that we could run analysis of, where is there excess demand for these machines. And that was my experience that was an example of my experience of the ability of a large, sprawling bureaucracy to adequately respond at pace to an adverse shock, to an emergency. It's not what they're designed to do.
And as for whether or how we can be more American in terms of our dynamic entrepreneurial spirit in the UK, is that something that you recognize as just being so deep-seated in American culture and perhaps absent here? Or did we have it and can we get it back some?
Well, I would recommend that folks read the book of our good friend Anton Howes. I think that there's a long tradition of entrepreneurial spirit in the United Kingdom as well. In my personal experience, it does help to be able to put numbers on the costs of these things. And that's why I definitely recommend those two chapters in the 2020 and 2021 economic reports of the president. Because if you can start explicitly saying, okay, this is the cost. This is what it's costing you to implement this regulation per household. I think that helps inform the discourse.
Yeah, absolutely. Bruno Pryor. Oh, no, Daniel. You go first, Daniel. The microphone's nearer to you.
Hello, Tyler. Thank you so much for your talk. It was, a really interesting summary of the biggest problems that the British economy faces, but it was incredibly depressing. So I'm wondering, if you had to pick out one sort of area for optimism about the British economy, what would you pick, if there is anything?
I think it was noted on this stage. The UK economy has all the fundamentals right, has all the institutions right, and I would highlight the higher education system. You're producing a lot of great scientific research. You have a number of great pharmaceutical companies. So it's just a question of recreating the UK equivalent of like a Silicon Valley or Boston or any of these other agglomerative centers of technological innovation. I think you have all the ingredients there, and this is why I initially formed the thesis as the country's just not fully utilizing things efficiently.
Brilliant. Thank you. Bruno.
I'm Bruno P. I'm one of Brian's small businessmen and trustee at the IEA. Thank you very much. I learned so much from that. I just wanted to challenge almost your last point, which is that we need politicians who believe in growth. And I would say, barring green degrowthers, they all believe in growth. They all believe. The problem is where they think growth comes from. And that's actually, to Christian's point, that is very much a battle of ideas. We're battling Matsukato is. So you can understand why politicians are tempted from a public choice perspective to sell the idea they've got the fix. We're going to come in, we pick these things. And to go to energy, of course, we picked energy in the 70s and the early 80s, and it crucified us. Energy autarky isn't something I think we should be promoting personally. But anyway, so my question for you is, given the public choice incentives, how can we make it feasible for someone who believes in the right idea of getting government out of the way, not government offering the fixes? How do we make that electorally deliverable?
Well, and I certainly would not advocate energy autarky either, to be clear. And the UK is connected to an integrated European gas pipeline network, and my point with simply there is the UK has historically had a comparative advantage in the extraction and transformation of molecules to unleash energy, particularly the carbon molecule. And I got to say, this is a very exciting time to have that sort of advantage, because right now, the company I work for, we recently signed 3 contracts with an industrial gas company, a steel manufacturer, and a fertilizer company to engage to provide carbon capture and sequestration technology. Those 3 contracts alone will remove as much CO2 as putting 2 million electric vehicles on the road in the United States, which incidentally is about how many EVs are on the roads in the United States today. So I think it's a very exciting time to have that sort of
a historical comparative advantage at a time when the life cycle of the carbon molecule is front and center. And then in terms of the political economy, I would have to defer to the IEA on that.
We have to fight the war of ideas. We are still fighting the war of ideas. We have to create that. We're a politician.
Yeah, and absolutely, Bruno. And I'm struck by the fact that one of the IEA's early and most noted publications was, I think, called Growthmanship. And it was against growthmanship because what it saw at that time was sort of an earlier generation of the Matsukatoism. It was the idea that government generates growth, whether it was through Keynesian demand management or whatever else. So perhaps there is a name for it, and I do sometimes worry. I talk endlessly about economic growth. I don't want to be mistaken for a growthman in those 1960s terms. There's a gentleman at the back there, yes.
A quick question about getting growth back to where it was before 2010. Don't you think we ought to have reduced tariffs? I'm an independent tax consultant, so don't you think you ought to reduce tariffs worldwide to get the growth rate back to trend prior to 2010?
Well, I'm not sure if tariffs have increased substantially since 2010, but I could be wrong. But
no, I mean, it's...
But actually, I would also add, I would actually like to see more pearl clutching over the imposition or increase of other taxes as there exists for tariffs. A tariff is a tax. And one can have a reasoned debate about the incidence, one can have a debate about the relative elasticities of supply and demand, and therefore the size of the deadweight loss. But, tax policy 101 is you generally want to lower marginal rates and broaden the base. So it's not a priori self-evident to me that proposing an increase in the rate of taxation on $3 trillion in corporate income in the United States from 21% to 28% is necessarily more efficient or less inefficient than a rate going from 3% to 10% on $3.3 trillion in imported goods and services. So I would like to see the same sort of interrogation of all forms of taxation that is generally applied to the imposition of tariffs.
Yeah, it's obviously good that generally people are pearl clutching about tariff increases. Free trade is a good thing, and I suppose that the deeper question there is about the distortionary nature of different taxes. How distortionary are they? What are their deadweight costs? Not all taxes are created equal.
I think I actually agree with you. The difference here is that a higher income tax does not protect any firms from competition. A higher tariff does.
All right. We've got another question. Yes, the lady there, please.
Oh, thank you. I suppose whenever I think of growth, especially nowadays, there's a lot of tearing down statues of slave traders from the Industrial Revolution and things like that, and there's a lot of this sort of identity crisis in the UK with all that colonialism, massive growth that caused damage to the environment, even with sort of the oil and gas. And I guess we've all seen a lot of this coming up lately, where you see, the damage caused by the oil industry, the damage caused by large companies, etc., the impact on the poor. And I can't tell how much of that is impacting our ability in the UK to want growth, want more sort of growth that's not good, growth that's greed, rather than growth that's good. And I suppose there's been a lot of companies where you see sort of behind the scenes and the guys running them and you sort of think, The Big Short was a sort of terrible, where you're watching it thinking, oh my God, what was all that? That was terrible. And so I how much do you think any of that comes into also what's going on now?
I think that's partly a question for Christian Niemitz, who's written brilliantly on this. But actually, just because you brought up The Big Short, if I can go to you on it first, Tyler, I mean, you can answer the question in general, but I'm particularly interested, how much do you see the kind of the visceral reaction that people had to what they see as the excesses of the financial industry in the run-up to the financial crisis as a barrier to addressing some of the problems that you talked about there? And then if you want to talk about the broader question of, are we just too guilty about the sources of our historical growth, or supposed sources of our historical growth, to really want to go for it today?
So I'm actually, in my non-existent spare time, finishing up a 190,000-word book on 350, almost 400 years of recession history in the United Kingdom and the United States. And as I noted in my remarks, economic growth is not about booms and busts. It's about trend and busts and then recovery. And yet, with every single recession, it's in our nature. We are pattern-seeking mammals to look for patterns. And so especially when we feel a painful stimulus, then we look to find out what potentially preceded that caused that painful stimulus. And so when the trauma of a recession, we look, okay, what happened before the recession? But by and large, recessions are about shocks. They are not forecastable. They are random. They happen because history happens. And actually, you can go back to 2008. And what's interesting about 2008, the highest ever inflation-adjusted price of oil. Can you guess when it was? It wasn't 1973. It wasn't 1979. It was June 2008. And the average American household was paying $2,000 more per year on energy, goods, and services than they had been just 2 years prior. How much more were they paying on mortgage interest? About $1,000 more. So was that rise in delinquencies in June 2008 because of excess home building and excess demand for housing, or was it because you had a once-in-a-generation energy price shock coincident with rising mortgage rates? And today, housing in the United States, it's not as unaffordable as in the United Kingdom, but home ownership rates among millennials are the lowest of any generational cohort at this point in time, and housing is widely considered to be unaffordable. So was that prices in 2006, 2007 telling us we need more houses? That's a long-winded answer, but no, I think we do feel guilty after shocks like that. It's in our pattern-seeking nature, but we need to overcome that. We need to look at, okay, what was actually going on?
And Christian, on the sort of broader philosophical point, this is something you've written about.
Yes, and I've done that precisely for that reason. I know some people were saying, why are you writing about statue toppling? This is a culture war subject. You should focus on the economics. I'd say that is the economics, because there is a philosophy behind this, and it would help our case. Those of us who believe in prosperity, who believe in economic progress, it would help our case if we could say, look, I wouldn't want to live in the Victorian age. If I fell into a time hole and came out in the 1870s, I don't think I would like it there. I'd miss a lot of things. But the Victorians got some things right. This was an age of a lot of pioneers. If you look at things like the rate at which the railroads, the rail tracks were growing, and you compare that to today, where you would have to, we would probably have 20 years of just impact assessments where they just got on with it and built things. And despite the fact that the technology was, by our standards, so primitive, all the things that they got done, it would help our case if we could say they got some things right. We should revive the best aspects of that time. And that's a case which is harder to make if there is a widespread belief that that this was a time in which Britain was only rich because it plundered its colonies, because that is the narrative which is underlying this statue toppling. And that is, even though these people may not formulate that in the language that an economist would use, they are making an economic argument. If you're saying, I think Jeremy Corbyn is somewhere in Jamaica right now, he's saying precisely this. He's saying Britain grew rich because we plundered you guys, and that's why we owe you reparations. Well, that's an economic argument. And purely in economic terms, it's just wrong.
Yeah. I think we may have time for one last question for Tyler, if anyone has got a burning question. Well, if no other hands go up, you can have your second bite of the cherry. Go ahead. Oh, there we go. The gentleman there. If they're quick questions, we'll hear them both together.
Yeah, I'd just like to hear a bit more about the solution to this finance point, in your view. Because what you were saying about the sort of the structure of finance and the structure of banking, I mean, should we be looking to break up some of our big banks in this country? I mean, I'm not proposing that, but what do you see as being some of the solutions to that particular issue, which I have to say I think was, for me, the really most interesting part of what you had to say and the most enlightening.
And do we want to take that second question quickly as well?
A quick one. My view is this country doesn't want to grow, is that we're pretty happy. The wheels haven't completely come off. The lights come on back to the 70s point. What shocks do you think it would require to really make people concentrate that the UK PLC is broken?
All right, Tyler.
So it's a really tricky one, because on the one hand, the evolution of British banking has been very good for banking stability. So arguably, it depends on how you define a banking crisis, but arguably from 1826 to 2008, the United Kingdom didn't have a banking crisis, whereas in the United States we had probably 11. And because the smaller but more numerous banks in the United States is great for relationship banking, but it does mean that you often have undercapitalized, underdiversified financial institutions that are vulnerable to regionally specific shocks. So I don't think the solution is more in smaller banks in the United Kingdom. I do think, and as I said, I don't have the answer for why it hasn't happened. I would expect to observe a greater, richer ecosystem of alternative non-bank financing in the United Kingdom, and I don't know why that hasn't arisen yet. But I think that is a more promising path than trying to disrupt or perturb a banking equilibrium that, for the most part, has evolved pretty naturally over the past 150 years in the United Kingdom. And then, as for growth, I think that is a challenge that many economies are facing as we continue on the demographic transition. And there are a number of interesting economic papers on what the demographic transition means for growth expectations and the desire for growth. And so I wish I had an answer there, but I think that is a challenge.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers, but especially Tyler Goodspeed for his brilliant narrative.